This forgotten hero was a brilliant man who almost changed this world forever. He had revelations from the Lord that were similar to those of Martin Luther 150 years later. And for that reason, he is known as the morning star of the Reformation. Sadly, the fire that he lit was snuffed out by the Pope. And we're here now at his church in Lutterworth, St Mary's Lutterworth in Leicestershire. John Wycliffe was born near Richmond in Yorkshire around 1327, and he went up to Oxford in 1345, and he rose to become the master of Balliol College in 1360. Soon after he arrived in Oxford, England was devastated by the Black Death. 30 to 40% of this nation died in that Holocaust, and maybe 2/3 of the clergy. It is impossible for us to understand the impact that this would have had on the society of those days. Until 1371, Wycliffe lived a life of an academic. He studied and he taught, and he gained a reputation of being the foremost philosopher and theologian of his day, not only in England, but in the whole of Western Europe. He was also a very gifted debater and arguer, which really helped him in the years to come. In 1371, he began to write, and he wrote mainly against the clergy and against the Pope. He recognized the corrupt system of the church, not only because of its enormous wealth, which was much resented, but also because the gospel was seldom preached. In part, this was because of the plague, in that it killed so many of the clergy that the people who replaced them were not competent, so that the preaching was more about myth and legend than it was about truth. He also wrote political pamphlets for his patron, the Duke of Lancaster. Lancaster was the third son of the king and one of the most powerful men in the country. He wrote that the gospel was the only source of religion, and that if a layman thought that the Pope had done wrong, he could reprimand him. Needless to say, the Pope was not happy about this and wanted Wycliffe arrested. So he was called in front of the bishops on several occasions to defend himself. And this is where his skill at debating came into its own. But because he had the Duke behind him, the bishops couldn't touch him. In 1378, there was a schism in the papacy. Two men declared themselves Pope. And so for the next years, there was so much infighting between them that they had no time to worry about what was happening in England or indeed with Wycliffe. However, this meant retirement for Wycliffe because political pamphlets were no longer needed. So he retired here to his church in Lutterworth. These were the years that crystallized his undying reputation as a reformer. He spoke on the authority of church leaders. He said that grace was available to everyone, whatever church leaders said. he attacked the authority of the church, and he attacked the superstitions of the church, like indulgences, which were one of the main income generators of the church in those days. Wycliffe went back to the New Testament as the model for church and for Christian living, much as revivalists did in later years, such as John Wesley. He believed in the priesthood of all believers. He attacked the Eucharist. He attacked the Mass. He attacked transubstantiation. And all the time he was using the Bible as his authority. Consequently, he became pretty unpopular with the powers that be. And it's not surprising, because he was attacking the very foundations of the society of those days. It was back here in Lutterworth where Wycliffe was the driving force to translate the Latin Vulgate Bible into the English language. He stripped away all the notes that had been added over the last hundreds of years, so that only the pure Word of God was translated. This would have been the first time that most Englishmen would have been able to read the Bible, because hardly anybody read Latin. And today there are still over 100 copies of Wycliffe's Bible around, and that is 600 years later, despite the church trying to destroy every copy they could find. Wycliffe's followers were called Lollards, and they went around the whole country spreading these new ideas to the people. One visitor at the time wrote that he thought that every other person that he came across was a Lollard, which leads me to suspect that a revival began when they went round speaking out these biblical truths. These men were very humble. They wore plain robes like monks. And even though what they were doing was against the law, they became very popular with the people. In 1381, there was the Peasants' Revolt. And the government used this as an excuse to come against Wycliffe's ideas and to come against the Lollards. Wycliffe himself was left alone, and he died 3 years later here at his church. And in fact, he was carried out through this door reputedly when he had his stroke. But the Lollards were not so lucky. Once the papacy had unified, the Pope brought the full power of the church to find the Lollards and to destroy the ideas of John Wycliffe. And sadly, several of these Lollards were burned at the stake around the country. And the Pope had one more act to perform, which he considered to be vengeance for what Wycliffe did. So this is where the Pope had his revenge. In 1428, they dug up Wycliffe's bones, burned them, and then scattered them here on the River Swift. I imagine that there would have been a bridge here at that time, so this could well have been the place where they threw the ashes into the river. John Wycliffe was also known as the grandfather of the Reformation. His ideas were later taken up by John Huss and Martin Luther. Wycliffe was also a very brave man. He obeyed the call of God on his life. He knew what was right, and he knew that he had to speak it out, whatever the personal cost. Today, we are in a similar situation. We need to speak out truth. We need to do it without fear and without succumbing to the intimidation of those who want us to be politically correct. This nation is in trouble, and we need to speak out truth, whatever the personal cost.